Episode 123, dated July the 1st, 1916. I filmed the Somme advance, Dauntless Courage of a Cameraman, by Lieutenant G.H. Malins, OBE, official War Office cinematographer. Read by John Winskill. Those who have seen the famous war film Forgotten Men will have a clear realization of the deadly risks taken by cameramen at the front. Mr. Malins, who was officially accredited to the War Office, here relates his thrilling experiences when filming the opening battles of the Somme, an exploit as truly courageous as any told by the fighting men. The units which Mr. Malins shot were in the famous 29th Division. The end of the sap came in sight. My guide was crouching there, and in front of him, about 30 feet away, running at right angles on both sides, was a roadway, overgrown with grass and pitted with shell holes. The bank immediately in front was lined with stumps of trees and a rough hedge, and there, lined up, crouching as close to the bank as possible, was some of our men. They were the Lancashire Fusiliers, with bayonets fixed and ready to spring forward. "Keep low as you run across the road, sir. The Boche can see right along it. Make straight for the other side." With that, he ran across and I followed. Then I set my camera up and filmed the scene. I had to take every precaution in getting my machine in position, keeping it as close to the bank as a false step would have exposed the position to the Boche, who would have immediately turned on HE shrapnel and might have enfiladed the whole road from either flank. I filmed the waiting Fusiliers. Some of them looked happy and gay, others sat with stern, set faces, realizing the great task in front of them. I had finished taking my scenes and asked an officer if the colonel was there. "No, but you might find him in White City. He was there about an hour ago." "Great heavens," he said. "Who would have believed that a movie man would be here? The nearest point to the Boche lines on the whole front. You must like your job. Hanged if I envy you. Anyway, hope to see you after the show if I haven't gone west. Cheerio." And with that, he left me. Packing up my camera, I prepared to return. Time was getting on. It was now 6:30 a.m. The attack was timed for 7:20. And as I wanted to obtain some scenes of our men taking up their final positions, I told my guide to start. "Duck as low as possible," I said, "when you cross the road." "We can't go yet, sir. Munitions are being brought through. And as you know, there isn't room to pass one another." I waited until the last man had come in from the sap, then practically on hands and knees, made for the sap mouth. "Cheer up, boys," I shouted to the men as I parted from them. "Best of luck. Hope to see you in the village." "Hope so, sir," came a general chorus in reply. Again I struggled through the narrow slit, then down the shaft and finally into the tunnel. We groped our way along as best we could. The place was full of men. It was only possible to get my tripod and camera along by passing it from one to another. Then, as the men stooped low, I stepped over them, eventually reaching the other end and daylight. The strafe was still on, but not quite so violent. Our parapets were in a sorry condition, battered out of all shape. Returning through King Street, I was just in time to film some of the men fixing bayonets before being sent to their respective stations in the firing trench. The great moment was drawing near. I admit I was feeling a wee bit nervous. The mental and nervous excitement under such conditions was very great. Everyone was in a state of suppressed excitement. On the way, I passed another officer I knew. "Are you going over?" I said. "Rather," he replied. "The whole lot of us. Some stunt, eh?" "Don't forget," I said, "the camera will be on you. Good luck." Bidding my man collect the tripod and camera, I made for the position on Jacob's ladder. But I was to receive a rude shock. The shelling of the morning had practically blown it all down, but there was sufficient for a clearance all around for my purpose and sufficient shelter against stray bits of shrapnel. I prepared to put up my camera. Not quite satisfied, I left it about 30 yards away to view the situation quickly, as there were only 20 minutes to go. Hardly had I left the machine than a whiz-bang fell and struck the parapet immediately above the ladder, tumbling the whole lot of sandbags down like a pack of cards. It was a lucky escape for me. Position was absolutely no use now, and I had to choose another. Time was short. I hastily fixed my camera on the side of the small bank, the side of our firing trench, with my lens pointing towards the Hawthorne redoubt, where the mine, the largest blown on the British front, was going up. It was loaded with 20 tons of a new explosive of tremendous destructive power, and it had taken 7 months to build. Gee, what an awakening for the Boche. My camera was now set ready to start exposing. I looked along the trench. The men were ready and waiting the great moment. One little group was discussing the prospects of a race across no man's land. Bet you, Jim, I'll get there first. Right-o, how much? A day's pay, was the reply. Take me on too, will you? Said another hero. Yeah, same terms, eh? Good enough. Say, Bill, he called to his pal, pay up for my cash if I go west. Shut up, fathead. We have to kill Huns, strafe 'em. I turned away to speak to an officer as to the prospects. Very good, he said. I hope they don't plaster our trenches before all the men get out. They're as keen as mustard. Never known them so bright. Look at them now, all smoking. Our guns were still pounding heavily, and the din and concussion was awful. To hear oneself speak, it was absolutely necessary to shout. You're in a pretty rocky position, someone said to me. Fritz will be sure to plaster this front pretty well as soon as our men get over. I can't help it, I said. My machine must have a clear view. I must take the risk. How's the time going? It's 7:10 now, he said. I'm going to stand by. Cheerio, best of luck. I left him and stood by my machine. The minutes dragged on. Still, the guns crashed out. The German fire had died down a bit during the last half hour. I glanced at our trenches. The officers were giving final instructions. Every man was in his place. The first to go over would be the engineers to wire the crater. They were already crouching down with their implements in their hands. Time 7:15 a.m. Heavens, how the minutes dragged. It seemed like a lifetime waiting there. My nerves were strung up to a high pitch. My heart was thumping like a steam hammer. I gave a quick glance at an officer close by. He was mopping the perspiration from his brow and clutching his stick, first in one hand, then in the other, quite unconsciously. He looked at his watch. Another 3 minutes went by. Would nothing ever happen? Time 7:19. My hand grasped the handle of my camera. I set my teeth. My whole mind was concentrated upon my work. Another 30 seconds passed. I started turning the handle. 2 revolutions per second, no more, no less. I noticed how regularly I was turning. My object in exposing half a minute beforehand was to get the mine from the moment it broke ground. I fixed my eyes on the redoubt. Any second now. Surely it was time. It seemed to me as if I'd been turning for hours. Great heavens, surely it's not misfired. Why doesn't it go up? I looked at my exposure dial. I'd used over 1,000 feet. The horrible thought flashed through my mind that my film might run out before the mine blew. Would it go up before I had time to reload? The thought brought beads of perspiration to my forehead. The agony was awful. indescribable. My hand began to shake. Another 250 feet exposed. I had to keep on. Then it happened. The ground where I stood gave a mighty convulsion. It rocked and swayed. I gripped hold of my tripod to steady myself. Then, for all the world like a gigantic sponge, the earth rose in the air to the height of hundreds of feet. Higher and higher it rose, and with a horrible grinding roar, the earth fell back upon itself, leaving in its place a mountain of smoke. From the moment the mine went up, my feelings changed. The crisis was over, and from that second I was cold, cool, and calculating. I looked upon all that followed from the purely pictorial point of view, and even felt annoyed if a shell burst outside the range of my camera. Why couldn't the Bosch put that shell a little nearer? It would make a better picture. And so my thoughts ran on. The earth was down. I swung my camera round onto our own parapets. The engineers were swarming over the top and streaming along the skyline. Our guns redoubled their fire. The Germans then started HE. Shrapnel began falling in the midst of our advancing men. I continued to turn the handle of my camera, viewing the whole attack through my viewfinder, first swinging one way and then the other. Then another signal rang out, and from the trenches immediately in front of me, our wonderful troops went over the top. What a picture it was! They went over as one man. I could see while I was exposing that numbers were shot down before they reached the top of the parapet, others just the other side. They went across the ground in swarms, and marvel upon marvels, still smoking cigarettes. One man actually stopped in the middle of no man's land to light up again. The Germans had by now realized that the great attack had come. Shrapnel poured into our trenches with the object of keeping our supports from coming up. They had even got their crumps and high explosive shrapnel into the middle of our boys before they were halfway across no man's land. But still they kept on. At that moment my spool ran out. I hurriedly loaded up again, and putting the first priceless spool in my case, I gave it to my man in the dugout to take care of, impressing upon him that he must not leave it under any circumstances. If anything unforeseen happened, he was to take it back to headquarters. I rushed back to my machine again. Shells were exploding quite close to me. At least I was told so afterwards by an officer, but I was so occupied with my work that I was quite unconscious of their proximity. I began filming once more. The first lot of men, or rather the remainder of them, had disappeared in the haze and smoke punctured by bursting shells. What was happening in the German lines I did not know. Other men were coming up and going over the top. The German machine gun fire was not quite so deadly now, but our men suffered badly from shell fire. On several occasions, I noticed men run and take temporary cover in the shell holes, but their ranks were being terribly thinned. Still more went over, and still a stream of men were making for the mine crater. They then disappeared in the smoke. The noise was terrific. It was as if the earth were lifting bodily and crashing against some immovable object. The very heavens seemed to be falling. Thousands of things were happening at the same moment. The mind could not begin to grasp the barest margin of it. The German shells were crashing all around me. Dirt was being flung in my face, cutting it like a whipcord. My only thought was whether any of it had struck my lens and made it dirty, for this would have spoiled my film. I gave a quick glance at it. It was quite all right. Fearful fighting was taking place in the German trenches. The heavy rattle of machine guns, the terrible din of exploding bombs could be heard above the pandemonium. Our men had ceased to flow from the trenches. I crept to the top of the parapet and looked towards the left of the village of Beaumont-Hamel. Our guns were bursting on the other side of the village, but I could distinguish nothing else as to how things were going. I asked an officer who was standing close by. "God knows," he replied. "Everything over there is so mixed up. The general said this was the hardest part of the line to get through, and my word, it seems like it. Look at our poor lads." I could see them strewn all over the ground, swept down by the accursed machine gun fire. A quick succession of shell bursts attracted my attention back to my camera position. Another lot of men were going over the top. I began exposing, keeping them in my camera view all the time as they were crossing by revolving my camera head. Shell after shell crashed in the middle of them, leaving ghastly gaps, but other men quickly filled them up, passing through the smoke and over the bodies of their comrades as if there were no such thing as a shell in all the world. Another spool ran out, making the fourth since the attack started. I gave it in charge of my man with the same instructions as before. I loaded again, and I had just started exposing. Something attracted my attention on the extreme left. What it was, I don't know. I ceased turning, but still holding the handle, I veered the front of my camera around. The next moment, with a shriek and a flash, a shell fell and exploded before I had time to take shelter. It was only a few feet away. What happened after, I hardly knew. There was the grinding crash of a bursting shell. Something struck my tripod. The whole thing, camera and all, was flung against me. I clutched it and staggered back, holding it in my arms. I dragged it into a shrapnel-proof shelter, sat down and looked for damage. A piece of the shell had struck the tripod and cut the legs clean in half, on one side carrying about 6 inches of it away. The camera, thank heaven, was untouched. Calling my man, we hastily found some pieces of wood, old telephone wire and string, and within an hour had improvised legs rigid enough to continue taking scenes. I set up my camera. Our gunfire was still terrible, but the Germans had shortened their range and were evidently putting a barrage on our men, who had presumably reached the enemy's front trenches. Nobody knew anything definitively. Wounded men began to arrive. There was a rush for news. "How are things going?" we asked. "Oh, we've taken their first and their second line," said one. An officer passed on a stretcher. "How are things going?" "God knows," he said. "I believe we've got through their first line and part of the village, but don't know whether we shall be able to hold out. We've been thinned shockingly." "Have you been successful?" he asked me. "Yes, I've got a whole of the attack." "Good man," he said. First one rumour, then another came through. There was nothing definite. The fighting over there was furious. I filmed various scenes of our wounded coming in over the parapet, then through the trenches, lines of them waiting attention. Scenes crowded upon me, wounded and more wounded. Men who a few hours before had leaped over the parapet, full of life and vigour, were now dribbling back. Some of them shattered and broken for life, but it was one of the most glorious charges ever made in the history of the world. These men had done their bit.
Goodbye, goodbye, when the tree may be dear from your eye, though it's hard to part, I know, I'll be tempted that I won't cry, but sigh, there's a silver lining in the sky, but swallowed Finch, old Chin-Chin, now poop-toodle-oo, goodbye. Brother Bert, he went away to do his bit the other day, with a smile on his lips and his lieutenant upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, "Remember he told the to death I go, don't cry.